Hello again. In this video, I'm going to talk about the poetic form we call the English sonnet, not only very popular in the 16th century, but a structure, a form of poetry that poets still explore today. Now, to sum up, any sonnet is a 14-line poem. In the English version, there typically are 3 4-line quatrains, and then a 2-line couplet that concludes the poem. In English, given the nature of the language, there tend to be more rhymes and more intricate rhyme schemes in the English sonnets. Poems are characterized typically by a volta, kind of change in the theme or emotion of the poem, and this is often signaled by the word but or yet. And typically, English poems are written in iambic pentameter. Now, in class, we looked at a poem by Sir Phillip Sidney, a courtier and poet of the late 16th century, his Astrophil and Stella. Looking back at it, I realized that it's not written in iambic pentameter. Each line has 12 syllables or 6 what we call iambs or feet. I guess that would make it iambic sextameter. But otherwise, you see that quatrain structure, how each of the 4-line groups present a theme or idea or conceit that is developed. There's a shift in the emotional idea of the poem or the theme of the poem at the but, and the couplet kind of resolve at least the conflict within the poet's heart. So his Astrophil and Stella collection is in your book. Certainly, if you're interested in writing about this sonnet form, you don't have to contain yourself to Shakespeare's works. Now, one other element that's, or let's say convention, that we often see in these poems is something called the oxymoron. An oxymoron is an expression in which two sort of opposites are combined. So, and today it's considered a kind of clumsy way of thinking. So, if you say something like, if you skate on thin ice, you'll end up in hot water. That is an oxymoron. The two ideas sort of contradict each other. But as a poetic device, it's typically what the poet is attempting to do is to combine two images into one that really contrast each other. So it shows conflict or maybe an emotional conflict. So here's an example. The first example is an oxymoron from one of Sidney's poems. In one of the quatrains, he writes, Some lovers speak when their muses entertain, their muses entertain, of hopes begot by fears, of what not what desires, of force of heavenly beams infusing hellish pains, of living deaths, dear wounds, fair storms, and freezing fires. So in that last line you see the oxymoron, the living death, the dear wounds, fair storms, freezing fires. Freezing fires, a classic kind of oxymoron. So again, what's he trying to express? Well, the emotional turmoil that his love is causing him. Now, obviously, like any convention, it can be overdone. It becomes stale and kind of cliched. In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, he makes fun of this oxymoron technique, and I just want to include it here because it gives you a sense of what a poet, a creative force like Shakespeare does with conventions. He doesn't ignore them. But he does reuse them for his own devices. It also is a way in which he characterizes Romeo at the beginning of the play as someone who really believes this nonsense that you often see in these sonnets. He thinks this is what love is. This is from early in the poem before he's met Juliet and discovers what love really is. So Romeo says, here's much to do with hate, but more with love. Why then, O brawling love, O loving hate, O anything of nothing first create, O heavenly light, O heavy lightness, serious vanity, misshapen chaos of well-seeming forms, feather of lead, bright smoke, cold fire, sick death. Sick health. So there, I think, is a case where our boy Romeo is just overdoing it. Shakespeare's using that as a way to indicate that this is the guy who's who doesn't know exactly what's going on inside his own heart. Now, one other poet of the late 16th century, Sir Edmund Spenser, and in many ways probably the most popular of published poets of the time. Spenser's work has probably fallen out of favor today. He certainly is not the genius that his contemporaries, Marlowe, Shakespeare, the young John Donne were. Those are truly creative geniuses. Spenser's a little more of an amateur than they were. He was himself a courtier, served a lot in Ireland, which was a pretty miserable post if you were a young English courtier. And he wrote a number of poems trying to get the attention of the Queen and hoping that his prowess as a poet would get him a commission back in London. And it was successful to some extent. In your book, there's a very long epic poem that he wrote called The Fairy Queen, which is a kind of quasi-allegorical, mythological history of England and, I guess, the new Protestant faith. It's long, at times kind of tedious, at other times very interesting. But having been subjected to it in graduate school, I wouldn't force it on you. But if you are interested in exploring a text outside of the ones that we cover in the book, certainly The Fairy Queen's a pretty important work. Also in your book is Spenser's Amoretti. Amoretti is Italian for little love song, and I think that gives you a sense then of what sonnets are intended to be. They are kind of little love songs. This is the first sonnet in that collection. The editors of your book choose to preserve much of the original spelling, so that does make things a little tricky, but here's how that poem works. And you'll see both I guess maybe the limits of Spenser's talent and imagination, but also part of what he's trying to achieve. Now, I've included on the margin the rhyme scheme, so the A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, D, C, D, C, D, E, E rhyme scheme that is called today the Spenserian sonnet. So this is a kind of his signature rhyme scheme. And anyway, the poem goes this way. Happy ye leaves when, as those lily hands which hold my life in their dead doing might, shall handle you, and hold in love's soft bands like trembling captives at their victor's sight. The leaves here are pages. It's essentially the page on which the poems are written, or maybe the pages of the book in which the poems are published. And so in that first quatrain, he is sort of saying, you happy, or in this case, I think we would say lucky, you lucky pages that are able to be held by my beloved's lily white hands. And then the next quatrain develops a second conceit, and happy lines. These are the lines of the poems, on which, with starry light, those lamping eyes will deign sometimes to look and read the sorrows of my dying sprite, written with tears in heart's close bleeding book. Maybe overdoing it there, but again, the conceit here is that the lines of the poem are fortunate because she might sometimes deign to give them a glance, which is certainly what the poet desires from his beloved. And happy rhymes, bathed in the sacred brook of Helicon, when she is derived, when ye behold what angels blessed look, my soul's long lacked food of heaven's bliss. Again, Helicon, a classical allusion. I think the sacred brook of Helicon is associated with inspiration, probably with the Muses, I think. And again, that idea that the rhymes and the poems are fortunate because they might give her a little pleasure. So the couplet that ends it, leaves, lines, and rhymes, seek her to please alone, whom if you please I care for other none. So again, that sort of lays out the plan for the series of poems that constitute Amoretti. I'm going to look at one other of Spenser's poems, not because it's a terrific poem. In some ways, it's laughable and just a little weird, but because it is a poem that I think Shakespeare consciously mocks in one of his more famous sonnets that we'll look at next time in class. This is a long, extended metaphor in which the beloved is compared to the flowers of the garden. But each of her part of her body then is associated with a different flower. And this is called a blazon, a blazon. Blazon is a kind of part by part, head to toe description of the beloved, where the lines of a poem kind of focuses on a different aspect of the beloved. So when we look at Shakespeare's famous example of blazon, think back to what Spenser is doing in a somewhat amateurish way here. He writes, "Coming to kiss her lips, such grace I found, meseemed I smelt a garden of sweet flowers." He's praising her, the sweetness of her breath in that point. You can imagine dental hygiene in the 16th century being what it is. Sweet breath is something worth noting. "That dainty odors from them threw around for damsels fit to deck their lovers' bowers. Her lips did smell like unto gilly flowers, her ruddy cheeks like unto roses red, her snowy brows like budded bellamores, her lovely eyes like pinks but newly spread, her goodly bosom like a strawberry bed, her neck like a bunch of columbines, her breasts like lilies ere their leaves be shed, her nipples like young blossoms of jasmines." That last line certainly comes is a bit startling. I really don't know if that is as startling to a 16th century audience as it is to us, but I'll just leave it at that. I do have to say that at this time, women in the fashion was for women to wear extremely low-cut dresses. So maybe that's what he's getting at there. Maybe it's not that uncommon. "Such fragrant flowers do give most odorous smell, but her sweet odor did them all excel." So, whereas different flowers remind him of different parts of her body, taken together, she certainly smells better than they do. All right. Well, I'll circle back to Amoretti in a later lecture, or Amoretti 64 in a later lecture.